in a moment. So if I could ask people to please take a seat. Welcome to day 3 of the Parkland Conference. My name is Tara Milbrandt, and I will be moderating this morning's session, which is titled Environment, Neoliberal Assault. We have 3 presenters, and they are going to be each presenting for between 15 and 20 minutes, followed by a collective question and answer session. So I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. Randolph Haluza-Delay is a sociology professor at the King's University in Edmonton.
All right. Thank you very much. So I know that this title up here doesn't match more than like one word in the title that I gave in your bulletin. That's because I couldn't remember what I had sent in. But the sentence is the same. So what I want to do first is talk about what is assaulting, what is neoliberalism? And I haven't been around for all of the conference, but I think it's really important to identify this, because if we're going to talk about the neoliberal assault, I mean, the word neoliberalism has often been used as sort of a progressive politics gremlin or monster under the bed, often without definition. But I think it has very specific meaning that if we can pinpoint that, then we can really, well, every problem solution needs to identify the problem well to be able to say what the solutions need to be. Then I want to talk about 2 points of our complicity in that and get into the idea of cultural politics rather than just a political economic analysis. And the result of all of this is to really identify how a culture of ecological harm, unsustainability, and social injustice is being generated by both our complicity with the reigning, domineering paradigm of neoliberalism. So a couple of quotes up here. Whoop, that did not go anywhere. Okay. There we go, got to use a different, I think I'm going to take this off because it's really awkward. So a couple of quotes up here from Brenner and Theodore. While neoliberalism refers technically to a set of doctrines regarding the appropriate framework for economic regulation, the term has been appropriated by scholars and activists to describe the organizational, political, and ideological reorganization of capitalism that has been imposed through the attempted institutionalization of such free market doctrines in specific historical and geographical contexts. I'm of the line of people who think that capitalism manifests in lots of different ways. In fact, Gibson and Graham talk about a post-capitalist politics in which they say, things like cooperatives, credit unions, even communal organizations, economic systems in different cultures and so forth will manifest in different ways. The globalization of the ideology of neoliberalism, however, has meant that many places are taking that up. However, because local conditions are always different, we might not talk about the globalization of what were once more localized economies, but we could talk about the glocalization, some combination of the global and the local. This bottom quote might be a simpler one just to remember. Neoliberalism actualizes a specific logic of economic regulation across multiple fields of social activity. And this is my orientation to wanting to talk about the culture of things. All my research is oriented towards what will generate a culture or cultures of sustainability. I don't think it's very feasible to be ecologically minded and to have effective ecologically oriented practices in an unecological society. We don't have the institutional, the cultural, the social reinforcements to live well in the land together in an unecological society. So what is neoliberalism? And some of these characteristics have probably come up. The characteristics of neoliberalism being that the economic market is all, public service rollbacks, and this generates no sense of the public good. Public good is a meaningless concept under a neoliberal ideology, as well as individualization. And again, it's very difficult to talk about a public or a common goodness if we're always focused on the individual as the rational actor to whom everything is oriented. A neoliberal mindset generates this market logic of the rational individual actor with the individual as the judge of whatever is good, and valuation limited to economic values and usually monetary values. And this also produces the elimination of collective structures. So neoliberalism, according to Alex Law, represents a couple of shifts in power. A shift from the state to the market, a shift from society to the individual, and from egalitarianism to inequality. So, 2 points of complicity here. Several different kinds of criticism of neoliberalism can be generated, but it's a contended area, and I really want to emphasize how important it is to continue to speak of the public good and to emphasize that. First of all, valuation limited in this economic sense doesn't take into account many of the ways that we often think about value. You know, what do you value? And what do people in general value? What do other people value? And things like that. Philosophically, when we talk about valuation, we're not talking about what the market will say is a value for a thing. We may be talking about aesthetic or other values as well. So valuation, talked by economists, is a very limited way of thinking about value and becomes normatively void. Whatever the market will bear is what the value of the thing supposedly is. This undermines all notion of values except as value is personally desired, you know, the individual preferences of the individual, and usually limits value also to monetarization, you know, the money that it can bring in. And this extends to the ways that we think about nature too. So one of the predominant ways of focusing on the value of nature now has moved away from resource management simplistically, but has moved into the idea of ecosystem services. And in some ways, this is a beneficial move to say, what kinds of things does nature provide to the city of Edmonton, such as flood mediation or clean air and things like that. Okay, I guess you can see that way better on your slide than I can see it on mine. But ecosystem services is a response to the over-economization of our ways of thinking. Ecosystem services is a way, generally speaking, of trying to say, what is the monetary value that having creeks and floodplains and sloughs and things like that can provide to reduce the potential flooding in Edmonton. And I live in Millwoods. My house has flooded 3 times in the last decade or so. There's a lot of money being spent on big pipes to try to channel the water away because we've paved over many of the creeks and we don't have the ponds and the sloughs and so forth that used to be there. So there's a benefit to thinking about the monetarization of ecosystem services, but there's also a huge and gigantic danger to it. And you can see up there, this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is produced in 2005. A gigantic study with scientists from around 190 nations, over 1,000 scientists involved, social as well as natural scientists. 4 major sections of ecosystem services: the supporting, provisioning, and regulating of things, but also down there you can see the cultural. Because there was a recognition that that nature provides other services that aren't so, you know, kind of technically oriented, and provides aesthetic, spiritual, educational, and recreation services. And at one time I was a professor of outdoor recreation, and we talked about the value that nature provided for nature-based recreational activities. But there's not a lot of value in just taking a walk in a local park. It's hard to quantify those values, but worse and more difficult is, how does nature help to teach us? And what is the monetary value of the beauty of the natural world, or the spiritual dimensions of the world? And so some examples are here. I mean, nature provides more than just a pleasant place to live. It could also provide food. This is some pictures from the permaculture groups in Edmonton here. But it also provides a way for people to get together. So natural capital generates social capital. Might be one way to think about it, but to me it seems like a very limited way of thinking about that. And to me the whole talk of this kind of capital and that kind of capital is really kind of a neoliberal mindset, the economization of all things. Or another example, and this again comes from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework, and you can see that human well-being is related to ecosystem services through direct and indirect drivers, and human well-being and poverty reduction includes these kinds of characteristics. Basic material for a good life, which then says, you know, your preferences for a good life and what kind of life you want to live might be different than my preferences. How do we adjudicate those different kinds of preferences? And how do we economize or marketize or monetize those sorts of things? So again, I'm highly troubled by that reduction of human being to this way of thinking. Health, good social relations, security, freedom of choice and action. You know, I have kids, they're just past the age of teenagers, so they're talking to me again. My son and I used to go for walks and hikes and stuff like that, and sometimes we just walk the dog. I have no idea how to monetize the value of hanging out with your teenage son who doesn't talk to you other than when you're just like walking the dog and throwing a stick and stuff like that, and then he talks. How do you, in a neoliberal mindset, evaluate the value of the Jackie Parker Park and so forth like that? I'm going to skip that out the quote because there's too many words on these slides, these two say pretty much the same thing. Dan Williams, who's a social scientist with the United States Forest Service, says, I see a gap between recent theorizing about values in social and political science, and I'd add in philosophy and theology and some other domains as well, and how the topic is understood and applied in natural resources. Specifically, the field tends to take its value concepts from either economics or social psychology and ignores more sociological and political theory formulations. And why this matters is shown by this next example that I want to show you. After the Exxon Valdez ran aground and spilled its oily load in Alaska in 1989, government and corporate people tried to evaluate the losses with an eye to possible compensation for those losses. The exercise nearly ran aground itself in efforts to value the cultural and social losses suffered by Indigenous peoples. The monetarized value attached to loss of a village was initially suggested to be the cost to move the village elsewhere. Wow. Assuming simple substitutability ignored all sorts of familial, social, and geographic relations, ways of life, knowledge, and subsistence practices attached to that locale. Systems of meaning, social organization, and collective identity that would be lost or were impacted. Some studies even showed post-Valdez alteration in family visitation patterns, crucial to quality of life, social and cultural capital, child rearing, and minimization of risk. To their credit, the Valdez Compensation Board shifted towards ethnographic methods to determine values of the losses experienced by oil contamination. So again, trying to move from such a reductionist mindset towards more holistic methods and more holistic notions of the value and the ways that we live in the world. And another example that just happened this month is the Supreme Court decision about the Jumbo Glacier, or possible Jumbo Glacier ski resort. And the CBC reports that the Supreme Court removed the barrier for the year-round ski resort on sacred First Nations land, arguing that building a large ski resort on BC land considered sacred to a First Nation does not breach religious rights, the Supreme Court of Canada said in its decision. And the argument was that this First Nation felt that the spirit of the grizzly bear went to this locale, I don't know the details of that spirituality, but it went to this locale and that was its place of being. And that the Supreme Court said, well, people have the right to practice their religion, but the public good does not require us to protect the kind of the contents of their religion. but it becomes impossible to practice one's religion if the places in which one practices it and which have deep and unalterable meaning, ontological meaning, you could say, if those places are eradicated. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I don't really care if St. Peter's gets bulldozed or bombed, and all kinds of cathedrals happen, because the contents of my religion have nothing to do with that particular church or thing. It's not to say that Christianity and Islam and so forth don't care about natural places or human-built places, but that's not the content. So, different religiosities are shaped in different ways, and to me the Supreme Court decision is a very ethnocentric way of looking at ways of being in the world. So I want to emphasize, and I don't have a whole lot of time left, I want to emphasize the way that this generates individualization, and then lead on to Alberta specifically. And I was going to say a lot more about this, but then last night at dinner I was sitting across from the guy who I really liked this article. He wrote it, Martin Lukács. So he spoke yesterday, and since I didn't hear it, I didn't want to repeat anything he said. So Google that title and read it, because neoliberalism has conned us into fighting climate change and other problems in the world as individuals, not as collective actors. And this leads us to sort of a post-political, where we get involved in trying to make changes rather than as individuals rather than as those collective actors, and we miss the underlying cultural politics that is going on here. And here's just a couple of examples. There's discursive representations of what's going on. The sun is not the main driver of climate change. That's bullcrap. There's no science that indicates that, and yes, scientists have looked into that as a competing hypothesis. That's the nature of science. We look for rival plausible explanations and eliminate all of that we can. The definition of cultural politics is an approach that treats culture itself, the norms, the practices, the ways we talk about things, and the ways we interact, as a site of power and process and practice that need to be shaped and reshaped. And you'll remember a few years ago, some of these advertising campaigns were out there with discursive representations that Alberta is energy. Energy is what makes us Albertan. In other words, homo alberticus is homo energeticus. So we need a different kind of politics. I'm going to skip these things about environmental justice and move on to, when we talk about notions of justice, we also have to clarify what we are talking about. I was a representative at the UN climate negotiations last year in Morocco. These are the annual ones. They just wrapped up in Bonn this year. I was a representative for the World Council of Churches, and one of the most interesting events that I went to was this one that I took a picture of, where the German labor unions were talking about what will it take to have a just transition for the German coal workers as Germany transitions out of coal by I forget the year that they said, 2030, 2035, 2040. And afterwards, there's normally a Q&A, but that afterwards became a real debate, because the African activists stood up and said, what is justice for you is injustice for us. We need you off of coal by like 2023. Your just transition is climate injustice for us. So again, we need to work together in solidarity. And all this has to do with the way that power is represented. So rather than giving you more theoretical things, I also want to give you hope. At the end of those Marrakesh meetings, the 47 least developed countries in the world committed to going 100% renewable energy. So when you hear these discursive representations about we need fossil fuel to help pull people out of poverty, the poorest countries in the world said, no, we don't. We want to leapfrog that technology and go on to what is good.
Okay, thank you so much, Randy. So I'm happy to present our next speaker, Nicole Marshall. Nicole is a postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto, and as of last week, University of Alberta is fortunate enough to have her join as a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science.
Thank you. So I actually didn't think that there was going to be a lot of overlap, but as it turns out, I'm going to kind of pick up on a lot of stuff that Randy was talking about and bring it to the example of climate change migration. Specifically the way that neoliberalism, and I'm going to say liberalism as well, so even back further than neoliberalism, really works to individualize us, and how that is a really big problem when you look at things like climate justice. I'm also going to talk about what Randy was he got into a little bit, but I'm going to pull it out a little bit further, and that's the idea of place as being connected to something, and how place matters, and that's very different than the liberal or neoliberal version of territoriality, sovereignty, or property rights. Significantly different. And also about how what we're seeing happen is very reductionary, and it's bringing things down to a level of the individual, and that's a really big problem too. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about climate change, citizenship, and migration. I'm a political theorist, so bear with me. I don't have a PowerPoint slide because I'm a bit of a Luddite myself. But what I look at is the way in which climate change is causing people to migrate. And it's just starting now. It's not quite in the full swing of things, but when we look at the data coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, it's extremely likely that there are at least 3 to 5 states in the South Pacific, small island states, that will be submerged in their entirety by rising sea levels. This is not the only function of climate change that's going to cause migration. Up in the Canadian Arctic, the rate of warming is happening twice as quickly as the rest of the world. And things like the permafrost is melting, and so it's causing difficulties in terms of people living a sustainable life. All over Africa, you've got drought and desertification that's causing people to migrate because subsistence farming isn't working. And the way that we're seeing these things framed is a little bit concerning because they're taking experiences and kind of looking for ways to ground them in international law and international migration, which is really dominated by these neoliberal and liberal perspectives. So things like, especially in the Africa case, people can't maintain subsistence farming anymore because drought has become too significant. And so instead of being framed as a climate migrant or someone who is working towards being moved for climate change, a lot of times what you're seeing is a reduction down to, well, you're an economic migrant. And guess what? You're not a very good candidate because you don't really have the skills that we're looking for in terms of a good economic migrant. You can't bring a lot to our country. And so we're seeing those kind of reductions happening. There's a lot of work that's pushing back on that, so I don't want to say that's not happening, but it's a little bit concerning. My work really is to look at those small island sinking states and how we understand citizenship and how we might need to rethink the way that we understand citizenship. And so when we think about citizenship, and we think about it from a liberal perspective, as well as a neoliberal perspective, we're really talking about rights. Your rights as a citizen. And that comes down to a relationship between you and your state. It's what you can get from your state, and it's what your state can give you. And it really actually doesn't have a lot to do with the people around you at the end of the day, right? Like, we can all be Canadian, but we're not Canadian. I'm not Canadian because you're Canadian. We're both Canadian because we live in the Canadian state. And so far, in terms of how we understand international human rights, that's actually functioned fairly well. But in the current moment, with sinking states, we have states that will no longer exist under international law. There's a bunch of laws out there. If anybody's really terribly interested, you can contact me. I can give you the information on it. But under international law, what we're really looking at is if your state ceases to exist territorially, so if the land goes away, it doesn't exist politically either. And so there's a really big question that's left of what is going to happen to these people. If the only real way that we understand our relations in the world is through this rights discourse, and that is about to collapse, my work suggests that we're actually looking at something from a theoretical perspective that is extremely troubling because it's the moral legitimacy of the whole system. Right? International law has, coming out of World War II, international law has put in things to place to make sure that everybody has a nationality. Everybody has a state. And if you don't have a state, we put in things like the Refugee Convention or the Convention on Statelessness to ensure that even if you don't have a state or you've had to leave your state, you still have access to some kind of state-like power. And so what it comes down to is not necessarily a question of pragmatism, although there is a question of pragmatism, where will these people go? But it actually comes down, from a theoretical perspective, I think, in terms of what happens to their collective agency. I suspect, it hasn't happened yet, so it's a guess, but I suspect if a state becomes submerged, somehow those people will find a new place to live. Right? I don't think we're going to see a massive extermination of people left to their own devices. I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out. A lot of the stuff that I'm seeing in my research, if you look at a place like Kiribati is one of the islands, Tuvalu is one of the islands, the Maldives, there's a whole bunch of them. But if you look at somewhere like Kiribati, the state has really taken a perspective to upskill its labor class. And the idea is that if they can work really hard towards upskilling younger generations, then those younger generations can enter into the labor migration, the international labor migration market, get jobs, and then bring over dependents, either older dependents or younger dependents, through traditional migration structures, right? Which makes a lot of sense when you look at it through, especially the neoliberal landscape, right? That's how you get migration, is if you can bring some kind of value to the place that you're going. But from a climate justice perspective, that doesn't actually make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense at all for a few reasons. One, small island state peoples had very little to do with creating the conditions of climate change that are now forcing them to consider migration. Two is that if you look at the actual people who live there, that individualized economic migration landscape, it doesn't make any sense. One of the studies that I've been looking at a lot recently is there's an author who went and looked at elite and non-elite perspectives. So people who are in the government and people who are not in the government. When you talk to elites, elites are all about these, we've got this under control, we're going to upskill our laborers, it's not going to be a problem, we're going to find pathways for migration that will work. And when you talk to non-elites, the answer all across all of the islands that I have looked at is, we're not moving. I have no interest in upskilling my labor, I'm not moving. And of course people come back and say, well, that's lovely, but sea levels are rising and you're going to have to consider migration at some point because your land will not be here. And that reality doesn't seem to be accepted at the non-elite perspective. And why is there such a pushback against this? Some of my research has suggested that there is such a pushback because for the Kiribati or Tuvaluans or people from the Maldives, it's part of who they are. And this is where place comes in. They are islanders. And this is something that's, I think, really difficult to understand from the kind of Western version, right? Where we live on land because we live on property. And it's something that we live on, and it's not a big deal, and if we need to move, it's fine, right? Which you kind of mentioned a little bit, Randy. But for islanders, that is their identity, that piece of land. And part of that comes back to the fact that their ancestors are there. And they are interconnected, historically, with their ancestors. And the two things are playing out beside each other in a way that is completely disconnected. It's completely disconnected, which is really concerning. Because when you actually talk to the people who are going to be forced to migrate, and you say, don't worry, we have all of these solutions for you, none of those solutions hit home. right? None of them make any sense in the context. And so what I'm trying to look at in my own research is this question of collective agency. And can collective agency related to place exist in some interesting sort of theoretical way outside of the traditional citizen-state relationship? I haven't figured anything out yet. I'm sorry. I've just started my postdoc research, so I'm still working at it. But it is something that I think is really interesting from a theoretical perspective, because it starts to question some of the ways in which our political being has been reduced significantly to a transaction. It's something that we get from the state and something that the state gives to us. And if the state fails to do that, then the international community will step in to make sure that we can continue those sorts of transactions. And that, again, it doesn't make any sense in the context for the small island state peoples. And another place that it doesn't really make any sense is in the context of Indigenous societies. I'm starting to look into Indigenous law and Indigenous relationships with the land, bringing in this idea of place as an alternative approach, an alternative understanding about what it means to be in political relation. Because for us, in political relation, again, it's that exchange of rights, but in a lot of Indigenous cultures, the juridical relationship of people actually integrates land into that, right? It becomes part, a more holistic, a more well-rounded version of how we live. And that is something that makes a lot more sense in the current realities of climate change that we're facing than the traditional transactional, right? Because the transactional allows us to live as if we weren't connected to the land, which is what's created the challenge of climate change to begin with.
I don't think the traditional is transactional. I think transactional is new. I'm from a farm and I'm crying as you talk because I love that land.
Yeah.
I think traditional is place.
Yes. Right. Okay, so traditional is place. I'm talking traditional in terms of the legal. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should be clear about that. Like I said, I'm a theorist, so I'm talking like way back to, we can credit John Locke and Adam Smith. Is there no place, I don't think in that way. I grew up in a town. I love my parents. I love my friends. I love my family, and I have nostalgic ties to the place that I grew up in. But the kind of place that I'm looking at, it's not nostalgia. It's not nostalgia. And this is why I've really kind of taken into this Indigenous perspective, because it is legal in that it's not our tradition of legal, right? But it is legal in that way because it is brought into being. And it's brought into being in a way that Western societies don't. It's disconnected in Western societies. And so that is kind of where I'm coming from. Although I do understand kind of, you love the land.
Farmers love it.
Yeah, you love the land. But I think what we're seeing happen in the small island states, it's not, I love the land, I don't want to leave. It's, I can't leave. I am the land. I am the land. I can't leave, right? And so there's this huge dilemma from a theoretical perspective when you say, well, that's lovely, but you're going to have to. So how can you maintain that? How can you preserve that in a way that is just? Because again, these aren't the people who created the conditions of climate change. And so the situation that they're in is an extremely unjust situation. And I'd like to leave her on a happier note there, but I don't really have an answer for this, but it's something that I'm really concerned about. And I'd like to push back a bit on just that juridico rights perspective, because it really does fail to capture a lot of what's going on. Thank you. And so theoretically, like I said, my work actually makes the grander suggestion that climate change is undermining the international system of human rights. And that's a huge thing from a theoretical perspective. And it's not necessarily something that people are going to recognize in their day-to-day life. But if you think about that coming out of World War II, I look at Hannah Arendt's work. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but Hannah Arendt writes, she was a Jewish person in Germany at the time of Nazi Germany. And she essentially writes in Origins of Totalitarianism that because of that citizen rights relationship, what happened was the German state actually had control over the rights. And the German state decided to say, Jewish people are no longer German citizens. And in that move, from a theoretical perspective, they were able to essentially strip rights out. Right? This is before the Refugee Convention. This is before international law kind of stepped in and tried to grow that area. But they were essentially able to strip out the rights by denying citizenship. And so, in a lot of ways, this is what's happening on the climate change perspective. It's not necessarily an active decision that's being made, although you could make the argument that we are actively supporting that decision by enabling climate change to continue, by doing things like, well, we're going to just take our time and do this in a just way in our transition and things like that. You can certainly make that argument. I think you can also say it's not quite as active decision as what was happening in Nazi Germany, but there are overlaps there. And so she says that's a problem. It's a problem that relationships of rights and relationships of human politics rely on a state. And that's something that I've really picked up on and tried to think about a little bit more. And her solution is instead to ground our understanding of rights in a common humanity. And I think that's very interesting. But I also think it fails to capture place. It fails to capture place as identity because it puts place in human relationships, which is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't bring in the land. And so something that I've been looking at, because everybody always asks me, well, what's the solution, Nicole? Something that I have been looking at that I actually think holds a lot in terms of its theoretical capabilities is this idea of kinship rights. And again, that comes back to the Indigenous perspective. And kinship makes space for all of that. And there's huge questions about if the land is actually gone, is there a way to maintain that? Kiribati has purchased 6,000 hectares of land in Fiji, but it's not the same. And just because you bought land, it's property. It's not the same as sovereignty. It's not the same as collective agency. And so can we make space to maintain that collective agency, that collective identity, if the land disappears? Maybe. It's going to take some broader thinking, though. And it's going to take really outside the box thinking. And will we get there? I don't know. But what I will leave you with today, Jean-Luc Nancy, he's a political theorist as well. Well, he's a theorist anyway. We use him in political theory. He has written, and I think it's a really great quote because it gives power back to us in terms of making decisions. He has written, "We have to decide to and how to be in common, to allow our existence to exist. This is not only at each moment a political decision, it is a decision about politics, about if and how we allow our otherness to exist, to inscribe itself as community and history." And it's a quote that really speaks to me because the kind of otherness that we're talking about here is a very significantly different otherness than, he's not writing on climate change migration at all here, but the kind that I'm talking about is a very significantly different, rooted perspective on how we would exist with each other and how we might have to consider existing with each other as climate change continues to progress. So I hope I've given you some food for thought. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. So our third and final speaker, whom I'd like to introduce, is Angele Alook. Angele works in the labor movement as a researcher for the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. She is also a co-investigator on the corporate mapping project, which if anyone was in the extreme oil session yesterday will have a good sense of. So over to you, Angele.
Sorry, I'm short. Yeah. Okay, so the title of my presentation is a story about oil, water, and life. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust this. When I was putting this together, I was thinking of all these interesting theorists and feminists and scholars, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that I could cite. But what I came up with is I'm just going to talk about my approach to my research from a Big Stone Cree Nation member Treaty 8 perspective, and my feminist approach to studying resource extraction in my traditional territory. So this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about a bit about my doctoral research, in which I looked at Indigenous life courses, racialized gendered life scripts, and cultural identities of resistance and resilience. I'll talk a bit about the corporate mapping project, and I'll talk about a pressing issue, which is the land rights and water rights of Big Stone Cree Nation. And then I'll talk a bit more of another research project I'm a part of, which is the Feminist Energy Futures Research. So, what is Indigenous feminism? I've read a bunch of scholars like Kim Anderson. Actually, I take quite a bit from Kim Anderson and Janet Akus and others in looking at this nexus between patriarchy and colonialism, which has impacted the gender relations of our communities. And what I've taken from Kim, this image here is from the work by Kim Anderson, from her book. I can't remember the title right now, but what I've taken from her is that there's power in Indigenous womanhood and reclaiming who we are as women. And historically, as women in our own communities, we held powerful economic, political, and we were spiritual leaders in our own right, and that we need to reclaim these identities, and that we need respect as women in our communities, whether we're mothers, elders, or teachers. That's what I've taken from Kim's work, and thank you. So, a story about life, and I'm Cree, so we like to tell stories. So I've written this as a story. For my PhD research, I have a very long research question, but why do people leave the community? I come from a petroleum-dependent community in the heart of the oil sands, and I asked a question about migration. How does the migration process between the reserve and urban areas affect cultural identity? What I came to actually talk about more than anything was family and connections. The methodology I used was Indigenous research methodologies. I used Cree storytelling, which I write as Achimauan. I talk about respect and that we are all relations, which Janet Akus calls Gakiawig na Wakumanag. And also Steinhauer talks about Gichitao and having respect as listeners and tellers of stories. And I also used my late grandmother Mary Young's approach to making moose hides as a theoretical approach to my research. So I combined traditional Indigenous concepts with Western tools, and I go into that extensively in my research. So, as some of you know, and from reading Kim Anderson's work, she's an Indigenous Cree Métis historian. She talks about the pre-colonial history of Indigenous societies that had gender relations where men and women had equal but different roles, where womanhood and autonomy were valued and respected, where we had healthy family units based on balance, reciprocity, sharing, and caring. And that in my research, I talk about the breakdown of Indigenous families, which was an intended thing of colonialism. And this was done through the Indian Act, which has within it gender discrimination, residential schools, which has taken children away from their families, and also the child welfare system and the 60s scoop, which we know has taken many children from our communities and broken our families apart. Where I'm doing my research is Gitaski now, our land, and I've taken this term from a project my dad was actually a part of in 1999, where we did a cultural land use study between the Big Stone Cree Nation and the Métis. And my community it's a fairly large community. We have about 3,500 people in Wabasca. This is where my community is. It's in the heart of the oil sands deposit. Those dark red marks are the treaty land. And those are our 3 lakes. There's the North Wabasca, the South Wabasca, and then there's the Sandy Lake. And if you look at the corner there, we also have, we had members in Peerless and Trout. So my First Nation has a long history of treaty, script, and the Indian Act. On Friday, I gave a talk about this long history and how we had a very large treaty land entitlement claim, which was 100 years in the making and about 20 years of litigation and about $10 million spent on lawyers and legal fees. I'm just going to pass over that, actually. One of the things I talk about in my research is our connection to the land. And one thing I've learned from Kim Anderson is that our relationship to the land is similar to our relationship to family and community. Our traditional subsistence practices of hunting and fishing and harvesting give us a relationship to the land, and the resource extraction industry is severing our relationship to Gadaski now. These traditional practices are also our treaty rights. In my qualitative research, 2 of my community members, and actually quite a few of the community members I interviewed talked about this idea of our roots are in the land. Our roots are with our family. Our roots are with our traditional practices, and that's why many people continue to live on Treaty 8 territory. In my research, I looked at the history of Treaty 8 and script, and this history is actually a history of families. It was a bureaucratic process in which Treaty and Métis were given certain land rights. But it's actually a history of how the government divided us racially between the Métis and the Cree. And that really we're all relations. I think this just goes more into that as well. So one thing I found in my research, I was actually looking at the agency and choices people make in school and work. But what really came out is this importance of family and Indigenous understandings of family. And they seem to persist even after the colonialism and the patriarchy that broke apart our families. The Indigenous model of family is one in which the child is central to community and where elders are transmitters of traditional knowledge and caregivers to children, and where womanhood and fatherhood are valued. This was very apparent in the research. A lot of the people that were successful in school and work had very strong extended family networks, or they made the choice to build healthy family relations. One of the key findings of my research was that Indigenous men and women had to contend with specific life scripts. I'm a life course researcher, so I look at how certain milestones and events in people's life early on impact later events. So one of the life scripts, or one of the stereotypes they had to contend with, is that Indigenous men would just inevitably drop out of high school and go work in unskilled jobs in the oil industry. Indigenous women had to contend with this life script, this kind of stereotype in the back of their head that they would end up having children at a young age and likely end up living in poverty. However, the community members that I interviewed showed agency and they resisted these life scripts. And through the support of community and family and their own resilience, they made the choice for education and to avoid this marginalization within the labor market. And here I talk about these identities of resistance and resilience. And then I also give some policy suggestions for education and employment and training programming in which we should incorporate a lifelong learning model that respects our traditional gender relations. So this is another aspect of my research where I tell the story of oil. Oh, I feel so short. So one thing I've argued, and I've just written a piece with Ian Hussey and Nicole Hill in the Monitor with the CCPA, where we talk about how work in Alberta is very gendered and very racialized. One thing is clear in the oil sands: paid and unpaid work is very gendered. Women are primarily responsible for social reproduction and caring work, whether it's done in the home or the corporate realm of work camps. It's primarily men going out into the oil patch making the big bucks, and it's mostly actually white men that are making the big bucks. Also, Alberta does not have the best labor laws or history of labor laws. We have the worst pay equity in all of Canada, and we have no pay equity legislation here. And when you actually look at the way our labor force is segmented, only about 6% of workers make up, only about 6% of employment in Alberta are workers that are directly within the oil industry. And most of them are men. So I argue that colonialism and racism exist very blatantly in the oil patch, and through the colonial regime of the Indian Act and immigration policies, that the oil industry divides workers by race, space, and the law. And I noticed recently in a couple studies where workers of color and Indigenous workers often cite being the last hired and the first fired. Also, Indigenous workers, through my own research and a lot of other research, has shown that Indigenous workers and workers of color are more prone to precarious employment and more likely to be streamed into unskilled work, and therefore have fewer labor rights, which ties back to my doctoral research. Another aspect which has been recently pointed out by Amnesty International is that violence against Indigenous women is normalized in parts of the resource extraction industry. Violence is pervasive in the lives of Indigenous women, and although historically colonialism and patriarchy has increased the amount of violence faced by Indigenous women, we find that this violence is intensified in resource extraction regions. So I like to argue that Alberta has a culture of racialized and gendered work, which is predicated by the government's colonial and racist policies of immigration and the Indian Act, and undertaken by the oil industry to make profits by keeping Indigenous workers and workers of color primarily in precarious employment. And women are left to carry out the reproductive and caring work, so white men can do the real work. So I've also started some more research with the Corporate Mapping Project, which I've entitled Miopa Matsuin, which is a concept that's been going around. I know there's researchers in Saskatchewan that talk about Mio Bimotin, or to walk a good life. But I want to study the lives of Indigenous workers in the oil industry and their spouses, to look at family from a holistic perspective, and also taking into consideration how work in the oil industry impacts the community overall. So here's my main research question for the Corporate Mapping Project. How is Miopa Matsuin of Indigenous families disrupted by the colonial and capitalist structures and practices of the oil industry? Is seeking Miopa Matsuin reconciliation? And will sustainable development ensure Miopa Matsuin for future generations? And I think we've mentioned climate justice a few times during this conference, and I think part of this idea of climate justice is the intergenerational impact of climate change. And so that's one of my questions. So I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, oh no. So in March, I wrote a letter of concern on the water rights of Bixson Cree Nation. And I said, there's something happening underneath our feet. It will stop the rivers from flowing and the lakes from filling in the spring. We will lose our fish, our moose, and our traditional ways of being. So recently, CNRL and Husky Energy have put in applications to use basically all of the water in our South Wabasca Lake. They're proposing to use our groundwater because it's cheaper to use groundwater than it is to use brackish water. But that also happens to be some of our drinking water and some of the water where our fish are. And so there's a little bit of history here. In February, actually, the Chief and Council wrote a statement of concern that these two oil companies plan to remove a combined 760 truckloads of water every day for 20 years. And the reason I measure it in truckloads is because there's still parts of the reserve that get their water through water trucks. And I think we only use 1 or 2 trucks of water, and so, like a day. So this is insane, the amount of water that they're proposing to use. One of the main points I made in my letter of concern is that Treaty 8 members often proclaim our agreement exists as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. So if our rivers and lakes stop flowing, does this mean our treaty is null and void? Will we also lose our homes, our ability to hunt, fish, and harvest? Will we lose the rights to self-determine the future of our lakes and rivers as a sovereign people? If you take away the water, you take away our lives. And I think that's similar to island nations, which are losing their land. And this history goes back. We've been having issues with our government around our treaty land entitlement. In 2013, we also stated similar concerns about pollutants in the water. And on March 12th, the First Nation began setting up toll stations and seemed prepared to ban multinational corporations from the traditional territories. But it actually didn't happen. So this action actually didn't move forward the way it was planned, because we got a lot of pushback from the oil industry and from the Ministry of Indigenous Relations. And then our Chief and Council had to go into more negotiations and talks with Indigenous Relations. So, I mean, talk about neoliberalism. So we didn't actually go through with a ban, but I'm told we're still prepared to if we had to. So what I talk about is that sustainable development should support the traditional subsistence practices of our people and should support a First Nations economic development plan. And the sovereignty of our nation needs to be asserted. For too long, we've allowed industry to bulldoze us with failed promises of economic benefits to our community. And that's one of the aspects of climate justice, is that we are the most impacted by development and resource extraction. We have our higher rates of cancer, and our waters are poisoned, and our soil is being poisoned. But we benefit the least economically, and we're put in the most precarious employment. I kind of tie this back, and we have boil water advisories all over Canada. And I question whether drinking water is actually a human right. You know, and you were talking earlier about human rights. And I really, I don't know, it just really saddens me. Our human rights don't matter, our treaty rights don't matter. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it's an aspirational document. It can be implemented by the government, but it's not an actual law. Yeah. And I cite a few of the articles from UNDRIP here, that Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of their environment and the productive capacity of their lands or territories and resources, and that governments shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their representative institutions in order to obtain their free and prior and informed consent to the approval of any project. But if you look at the way our laws are written, we actually have no veto power to say no. The only times that we can actually challenge industry or government is after they've done destruction to our lands. That's the way the laws are written. They're written to the benefit of resource extraction companies, not to the people that actually live on the land. So, if we don't closely monitor this situation, in 20 years we could end up losing our potable water from one of our lakes. I don't know what else to say. That's a picture of our lake. That's my nephew beside the lake playing golf. So is sustainable development a right for Indigenous people? Is it just aspirational under the Declaration? Is it a treaty right? Is it a human right? I mean, does it really matter where it's written in the law? We should have rights to our land and our water. So one thing I'm doing with the Feminist Energies Project, I'm just going to mention this lastly, is that, you know, we saw with the Standing Rock protest last year that it was highlighted that water is sacred, that water is life. I mean, it's not just Indigenous people that should think this. The water is life for all human beings, all organisms on the earth. But in Alberta, the only thing that we seem to hold sacred is oil and profits. And we can't sustain a life that way. So one thing I'm going to be doing with the Feminist Energies Project is examining the daily struggles of living off the land and maintaining our land rights. And I'm going to be doing that by, I've started discussions with Indigenous land management people in the Treaty 8 and the way that they work within that system and how they are not only public servants but activists. And from that I want to tell the story of Big Stone from our own perspective, based on our teachings from both elders and youth. So I'm interviewing both demographics. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Angele. What rich continuities and differences between the different speakers. So I'd like to invite the other two presenters to come to the front, and I will be moderating the Q&A part now. We have 15 minutes, and I will be looking for hands up and guided by the principle of, you know, diversity in voices. So we have the man there with the striped shirt, woman in the pink, man in the yellow as the first three questions, and that's all I can remember right now. So, great.
I am Carl. I'd like to make two comments. One is with regard to the publication in 1993 by John Ralston, a book by John Ralston Saul called Voltaire's Bastards. There he analyzes how the arguments that Voltaire made that reduced the influence of church on society are now being used by the elites that be to justify social and economic policies that are now known as neoliberalism. That's an excellent analysis that is in that book, published in 1993, 24 years ago, and I haven't seen anything here that's better than that. The other comment I have is about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The Valdez Compensation Board decided that Exxon should pay the people of Valdez $5 billion. Exxon says we'll give you $500 million. It went to the Alaska lower court. The court decided unanimously Exxon should pay $5 billion. The Alaska Supreme Court took the appeal that Exxon made, unanimously decided that Exxon should pay $5 billion. A regional court in the United States decided unanimously Exxon should pay $5 billion. A couple of other appeals were made, and each time unanimously the court decided Exxon should pay $5 billion. 10 or 12 years later, after 10 or 12 years of litigation, It went to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court decided that Exxon should pay $500 million by a 5-4 decision.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I'm from the Fishing Lake Métis Settlement, so just sort of close to your community, Angele. I want to talk about water rights. What I'm realizing is that people think that what has happened in California and with Nestle is so far removed from us, but it's really not in terms of determining who owns the water here in Alberta. I know in my own community, in terms of the Crown has essentially decided when our water rights begin and where ours begin and where theirs end, type of thing. So a certain distance from the shore is what we own or what we have stewardship over, and then they own the rest. And then what's happening is that big corporations are actually purchasing water rights for extraction purposes, and they're actually registering these rights. And we don't know this. And so essentially when the time comes, there are pipelines that are being built to purposely extract water to other countries. And so we are continuously becoming environmental refugees in our own communities and are having to leave our communities because it no longer sustains us. And then we become the unskilled laborers in urban settings. So I was hoping that you can comment on that.
Sorry, that was a lot. Not really sure how to comment on that. I guess I don't know. Do you have like a question, or because what I'm hearing you say is that the Métis are facing the same issues that we're facing, and that you don't find out until afterwards. And I think that's how our laws happen to be written in Alberta, is that resource extraction industries benefit the most. And, you know, and the Métis even have fewer land rights than the First Nations. So it's worse for you guys, unfortunately. I mean, the only other thing I could say is that some oil companies offer impact benefit agreements, but those are also expensive to even negotiate legally. So I don't know how we can even benefit from industry in our communities, especially with all the destruction to our environment and all. We live on the land, but we're the last to know what's actually happening to the land around us. It's funny, as I was preparing for this presentation, I really wanted to show this image of my friend Cindy Noski. She shared it on Facebook the other day. She was out prairie chicken hunting, and there was a sign put up by one of the oil companies that said, "No shooting, no hunting, men working here." And she got her chickens, so that was good. But you know, it's if you ever hear someone like Ariel Deranger or Caleb Ben talk, they show these amazing maps of our traditional territories of how there is so much industry left around us until basically the whole map is just a bunch of pipelines and ignores, you know, the boreal forest that it happens to sit in. Yeah.
One of the ways that I describe neoliberalism is I talk about the fact that liberalism, you know, this is a simplification, of course, is the extension of rights to individuals, you know, the focus on freedom for individuals from authoritarian governments. Then neoliberalism is the extension of rights and freedom to new individuals and specifically corporate actors. So that's one of the things that is going on, is that corporations now have the rights that we as human beings have thought in the last few hundred years were the human rights. And so that's a huge problem.
Well, I guess from my own perspective, this is why I don't like rights discourse. I don't think it's capable of fully capturing life. I think it reduces us down to, again, that transactional, this is mine, that is yours, which enables things like becoming a refugee off of your own land. That's why I've kind of looked into the Indigenous perspectives, because it's an alternative approach that doesn't get much traction, and it should. It's the only one that actually makes any sense, I think, in the context of the world that we're living in these days.
Okay, so we have space for just a few more questions. I'm going to ask for 3 questioners who are next in line to try to keep it very brief, and we'll just go to all 3 and then see what we have room for. So there's a man in the yellow who's next on the list, followed by the gentleman in front of me with a small child in the orange. You had your hand up? Okay, I thought you did a long time ago. There was a woman in beige to the right.
I had my hand up since the beginning.
Okay, I missed you. So, and the woman in gray on the right here. So that's all we're going to have time for. So if I can ask you to keep it very brief and to the point, and then we'll go to the speakers.
Thank you. Rod Olstead with the Edmonton chapter of the Council of Canadians, which of course water has been a focus of the Council of Canadians from the start. And Angele, I was thinking of course, I believe that you're referring to fracking when they're using that quantity of water, and so I'm thinking of the context of the Jessica Ernst case that's still, I think, in the courts, and we're still waiting to find out if the Alberta regulator has any duty of care, which apparently they claim that they don't, to protect the environment. And also thinking in terms of the notion of the precautionary principle. And I've kind of read some of the documents put out by industry in terms of whether or not there is a precautionary principle happening, and there seems to be a lot of distortion, I think, in the notion of the precautionary principle. Who's really responsible here? You know, in terms of, like, is it our responsibility as citizens and as legislators, I suppose, to prove that there's a harm from industrial action, or is it actually, which I believe the precautionary principle says, it's the responsibility of industry to be able to prove that it's safe? And how do you think that the precautionary principle is being interpreted in these cases?
This will be brief, but something I haven't heard mentioned at this whole conference, which oil production has been a central focus, is a legislation in 1947 when the Leduc oil well, I forget, Imperial something blew in. There's legislation passed in the Alberta legislature that nothing or anyone can impede the production of oil. And I wonder if the speakers know, it would seem apparent that that legislation is still in force, because farmers too cannot prevent oil extraction. Do any of you know?
I know that, actually. Do you know anything about that, Ian? Sorry. He's not here. That's who I would ask. So we'll just do the final question. And
Thanks very much for the presentations. I'd like to shift it a little bit. I teach a course about sacred ecology, and I'm wondering if we acknowledge this paradigm shift to Indigenous ways of knowing, seeing the land as sacred, the water is sacred. And there actually are European Indigenous traditions. I studied the ancient matriarchal cultures, which also honor the land as sacred and women as sacred. So I would love, Angele, you mentioned toward the end the idea that water is life. The earth is life as well, of course. If we can really begin to share those understandings of the sacredness of the natural environment which sustains all life, will this help to shift the discourse? And I think, Randolph, you also have done some work, in terms of spiritual ecology and some of the European religious traditions. So I'm wondering, could this paradigm shift help us to counter the neoliberal framework of land as property if we begin to emphasize that ancient connection to the land as sacred?
I don't think you need to be an Indigenous spiritual teacher to recognize that, water is life and water is sacred. I think, the fact that we have climate change refugees in islands around the world just shows that water is life. Water can take your life away, and you need water to live. And I think we give too many rights to resource extraction industries that don't recognize the importance of human life from any perspective. If you're a biologist or a zoologist, or if you're a Christian or a Muslim, we all understand. We were just at the Islamic Academy a couple weeks ago where they were talking about this idea of one ummah, one family, that we are all one family. And, we all have those teachings, and we are being controlled by corporations and industry that are obsessed with profits when we don't value public health or human health or human life or animal life. It's a very backwards way of thinking, and it's not to the benefit of any life on planet Earth.
Yep.
Yeah. But I have a question I'm going to ask, even though I haven't been recognized. What can we do?
I would say
What can we do to help that lady?
I'd say
I want to say that. What can we do?
say, first of all, we've got to take back the levers of working together and say we're not individuals, but we're collective actors. So conferences like this bring us together. We need to work in the political realm, but we can't only think about justice in terms of legal justice. We also have to think about it in terms of social justice and the moral principles that we think are important. I said before that there's a cultural politics going, and that's why I showed some of those slides, because there's actors who want to frame us in the very narrow, reductionist sorts of ways. Homo alberticus, what are we? Are we homo energeticus? I mean, that's the phrasing I use, but we're more than that because we're human beings, and recognize what that word means. It's an active verb of to be, and I think that we need to learn to live well together in the land. That's my definition of sustainability. To do.
Rock thing like Standing Rock might help people to believe that. It's easy to talk about values, but we go back to our individual little lives, and you people are still alone defending what we all depend on.
Yeah, well,
Somehow help you defend that.
yeah, I think what we saw from Standing Rock is the solidarity from all sectors of progressive left movements. Yeah, because some people say we live in a petro state where it's hard to do that, but I work in the labor movement, and we often talk about solidarity, of all marginalized people, and I think that's something we really need to work on in Alberta.
I need to cut things short. I believe this session actually ends at
5 minutes ago.
5 minutes ago. So it's wonderful that there's so many more questions. We had, kind of mixture from each side of the room. So I would invite those who have burning questions to come and speak to the speakers directly. Please join me in thanking our three panelists. Fantastic session. And I think the very best way to end a session is for there to be burning questions and conversations. So let's continue this. And please remember to fill out your feedback form for the Parkland conference. And I would like to offer 3 gifts from the Parkland, one to each of our excellent speakers today.